Coming up, an Indigenous scholar and author is ready to talk about their newest book. And get ready because it's a scary one. We're visiting with a Dial Fellow, and there's a new judge in Arizona's largest county. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amadawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start our newscast in Washington, D.C., where President Joe Biden has issued a proclamation designating November as National Native American Heritage Month. Part of the proclamation reads, "America has not always delivered on its promise of equal dignity and respect for Native Americans. But despite this painful history, Indigenous peoples, their governments, and their communities have persevered and flourished." The proclamation urged Americans to observe the month and to celebrate November 25th as Native American Heritage Day. And later this month, Biden is expected to meet with tribal leaders at the White House Tribal Nations Summit. Now to South America, where Colombia is remaining a dangerous place for Indigenous land defenders. A new report from the National Commission for Indigenous Territories says that in 2021, a Native person was killed every 4 days in the country. The commission says it recorded 114 homicides last year, 17 of which occurred in massacres. Indigenous leaders told the news outlet Al Jazeera they believe that many of the deaths come from people speaking out against the government. The deaths come as the country's police force has clashed violently with protesters and when land defenders have been outspoken against drug routes and mining. The report added that a third of the victims were between the ages of 18 and 32, leaving some to think that the killings are targeting the next generation of political leaders. Canada's correctional investigator Ivan Zinger released another report detailing the over-incarceration of Indigenous people in the country's prisons. APTN's national news team was at Zinger's press conference on Tuesday as he laid out the possible root causes to the issue.
We did a similar kind of work to try to update that 2013 groundbreaking investigation entitled Spirit Matters. And unfortunately, we found that the overrepresentation of Indigenous people over the last decade has continued to grow. We are now looking at the prison population in terms of Indigenous people represent 32% of the overall federally incarcerated individuals. And with respect to women, we, as you know, we sounded the alarm bells when it reached 50% of incarcerated women are Indigenous in federal corrections. We found, again, terrible outcomes with respect to Indigenous people who are incarcerated in federal corrections. And these included, for example, being overrepresented in use of force, overrepresented in maximum security institution, overrepresented in structured intervention units, which is the former administrative segregation regime. They are more likely to also be labeled as gang members. They're more likely to self-injure. They're more likely to attempt suicide. They're also overrepresented in the last fiscal year in terms of suicide. 5 of the 6 individuals that committed suicide last year were Indigenous. They also serve a far greater proportion of their sentences compared to non-Indigenous people. Most of them, the great majority, are being released at statutory release, which is at 2/3. And of course, they tend to do poorly upon release because their needs haven't been properly addressed. So they are more likely to have their parole revoked, and their rates of recidivism is off the chart, reaching out 65%.
The countries of Chile and Mexico are coming together to honor an Indigenous Nobel Prize winner in a very big way. Last week, a mural of writer, diplomat, and educator Gabriela Mistral was unveiled by Chilean President Gabriel Boric. The mosaic is a replica of one created by painter Roberto Montenegro and was donated by the Mexican Embassy to Chile. It was unveiled as part of a celebration marking the 100th anniversary of Chile's late poetry Nobel Prize winner arrival in Mexico. Speaking at the event, Boric made it clear how important Mistral is to both countries.
It
is tremendously exciting. Here we are not only remembering Gabriela, but we are filling this link between countries with energy. And I don't want to say coming back, it would be unfair, but rather reaffirming our Latin American condition. What Beatrice said is also very important. Chile is deeply Latin American, and Gabriela is a sample, an essence of that, which reminds us of our origin, our indigenous origin, our mestizo origin, our origin of words, taking the best of the language.
Mistral's work left a lasting impression and was fundamental in the design of an educational policy in Mexico. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Liberation for Lakota people through language, lifeways, and spirituality. That is the vision of the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. Its leader is Tatewi Means. She has been named a Dial Fellow by the Emerson Collective this year. The Dial was an American journal founded in 1840 by Ralph Waldo Emerson and others to shine a light on the best contemporary ideas of the day. Welcome, Tatewi.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So tell us about the Thunder Valley Development Corporation and how this fellowship will impact your work.
Absolutely. So Thunder Valley CDC was formally founded in 2007 as a grassroots community-led effort to really make transformational change in our community. But this vision of what this organization has come to be started long before that and has spiritual roots to our way of life. By a group of young people that were really restless and hungry for change that was meaningful for future generations, really kind of tired of waiting around for, IRA governments or other outside institutions to come in and solve the problem. So trying to be proactive in creating a movement and creating change. And so, Thunder Valley, we have a whole community approach that really takes aim at all the indigenous determinants of health across our communities through 8 initiatives, from food sovereignty to youth leadership development, workforce development, and the actual constructing of a 34-acre regenerative community right in the heart of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So our focus is Lakota youth and families all throughout Oglala territory, but our primary location is in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So this opportunity, as executive director, I came on board in 2018. I have a legal background. I was the Attorney General for the Oglala Sioux Tribe prior to this role, but really realizing the tremendous gaps in our community in focusing on healing and rooting our work in healing and collective liberation. And so what this fellowship means for me individually, building my capacity, my communication skills in delivering our message and sharing our work and hopefully amplifying the work of Thunder Valley as a whole, internationally, because collective healing is an international cause, it's an international movement, healing from colonization. Every part of the continent, every part of the globe is affected by colonization. And so this is a message that we hope can be shared throughout the world, and especially with other Indigenous communities. And so this fellowship will provide me that opportunity, and also build the capacity of our organization in our communication strategies so they're more intentional and have far-reaching impacts.
What are some of the concerns that you hear from, your fellow tribal citizens when you're at events or in the community? You mentioned a lot about healing from colonization, but I'm really curious in your conversations with people, what they tell you are their most pressing concerns.
Well, that's part of the challenge. It's part of the movement shifting, the narrative shifting work that we do at Thunder Valley. A lot of times when our communities have become accustomed to oppression and being in an oppressive state, there's tremendous amount of poverty and despair and hopelessness that our communities see. And so how do we shift the mindset? How do we shift the culture in our communities from a poverty deficit-based culture to one that is liberatory, that is forward thinking and thriving and planning for the next generations, which our ancestors were so good at. It's hard to do that when you're surviving today. It's hard to do that when you're trying to make it through this month and figure out which bills to pay and how to make everything work. So how do we meet the needs of today while still planning for the future and thinking about liberation in a really collective way? We're right in the middle of that challenge. We definitely don't have the answers, all of the answers to that, but that's what we're figuring out, is how do we, in doing this work, create this reservation-wide narrative shifting movement to get to that question with our communities, to get to the point where they're hungry for that change themselves, where they want to know about healing, where they're actively working on their healing and having these really conscious conversations around what liberation means.
Maybe talk about some of the projects or initiatives that Thunder Valley is currently working on right now, and some of which would make you the most excited. Tell us about those projects.
There's so much. I could take the whole hour. I'm just kidding. But so one that is top of mind for me is we launched our bison restoration project through our food sovereignty initiative. We're currently in the process of acquiring leases from the Oglala Sioux tribe and the BIA in the stronghold area of the Badlands, which has historical significance for Lakota people. And so launching within the next year, hoping to have a 400 plus head of bison. Building the infrastructure, putting all the pieces in place so that not only can it become a staple to our local reservation food system, but also a cornerstone of revitalizing and reclaiming our culture, our lifeways, our connection to our bison relatives, because they hold such significance to us. How do we incorporate those teachings and reach the young people across the reservation schools while also providing a food source to our communities? So that comes top of mind. Of course, our Lakota language efforts. We have 2 total immersion Montessori sites. We work in partnership with Pine Ridge School and have a total immersion classroom for kindergarten to 2nd graders in our effort to revitalize our sacred language. And so they're the reason we do this work, our young people. And so I'm always proud to share that aspect of our work, because it's the whole impetus and inspiration behind the work we do at Thunder Valley.
Well, Tatewi, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations again to you.
Thank you very much.
In Arizona, Maricopa County includes the cities of Phoenix, Tempe, Mesa, and others. The area has a population of more than 4 million people. That includes a large number of Indigenous folks. More than 85,000 American Indian and Alaska Natives live in Maricopa County. Now, those going to court could have a new judge hearing their case. Charlene Jackson is a citizen of the Navajo Nation and was recently appointed by Arizona Governor Doug Ducey to be a judge in the Maricopa County Superior Court. Judge Jackson joins us now to talk about this appointment. Hi, Judge Jackson.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you for asking. I want to talk about your judicial experience in both municipal and tribal governments, so maybe tell us about your background.
Sure. I started my career as an attorney, a Native attorney, working for the Gila River Indian community, and then ventured on to working for one of the tribes here in Arizona as a judge in the juvenile court system, and then eventually made my way back to private practice And in that private practice, I was able to secure some bench time, if you will call it, with the town of Paradise Valley and as a pro tem with the town of Gilbert, as well as procuring some pro tem assignments with various tribal courts, either in the trial court or in the Court of Appeals. And eventually, I did that for the past about 13 years, and then eventually decided to apply, throw my hat in and see what happened when an announcement was made at Maricopa County, and to see how things shook out. It took me about a year, but was finally able to be appointed by the governor, and I will assume duties on November 21st.
Tell us how you got the attention of the Arizona governor, as you just mentioned.
Well, fortunately, I was able to represent one of my clients in the Arizona Gaming Compact. We just recently renegotiated that compact. It took 5 years, and I was both, what I say, blessed and cursed to be a coordinator amongst the tribal attorneys in that negotiation process. So that gave me a lot of access to other attorneys that represent tribes, but also gave me access to the attorneys and the governor's staff. So I had some familiarity with the governor's office and their staff, and they were able to see my work ethic and the things that I represent as an individual. And so that was helpful, I believe, in securing my appointment. So that's how I got their attention, I guess, if you want to call it that.
I'm really curious if you can provide some context to our viewers about how big of a deal it is to be appointed to the Superior Court. I know that Native people historically have been underrepresented in these kinds of judicial appointments, so maybe talk about that.
Sure. I think it's been about 17 years since the last Native American was appointed in Maricopa County. That would be Judge Jolyn Gentry. And, we have other judges in municipal court. I think down in Tucson, there's Judge Jerry Hale. She is on the bench for the city of Tucson. And we have some recent Justice of the Peace magistrates that have been appointed fairly recently. But in order to be appointed in Maricopa County, it first starts off with, this big announcement that there's going to be a recruitment process, and you have to supply about 30 pages of information about your background, your experience, any cases you've litigated, any appearances before the court, both maybe tribal, federal, local. And then you go through a screening process by the Maricopa County Trial Court Appointment Commission. And they screen all the applications, and they whittle that down to about maybe 15 or 20, 22 people. And then they conduct interviews that are conducted in a public forum, and you can be asked a host of questions. For example, my interviews each started with a hypothetical where you're given a fact scenario and you're asked to explain to the commission what you would do as a judge in that particular situation. And that's followed up with several questions where they get to know who you are and what your thought process is. You're also required to answer some legal questions. It might be a constitutional law question. And then after that, they convene and they decide which names they are going to send up to the governor's office for an interview. And then once you pass that stage, you have to go up to interview with the governor's office, and you wait after your interview for about 60 days to hear whether or not the governor's appointed you or not. And if you're not appointed, you can go back and reapply at the trial commission level, or you can withdraw your application. So many times it takes more than one interview process to get through to appointment. In my instance, I went through the interview process 3 different times.
And in your new position on the court, what kinds of cases will you be hearing?
There were 4 of us appointed this time around, and each of us has been assigned to the family court. I will be in the Mesa Family Court. Other judges will be downtown. Another judge will be in the West Valley, I believe. And we're going to spend time learning about being a judge. The first few days are going to be observing other judges in action. We've also received the beginning training modules on handling family court cases. So I will be in that area for about 3 years, I believe, and then potentially rotate into another area.
This is a political appointment, as you just mentioned, so you'll serve for 4 years before you actually have to face the voters of Arizona. Maybe tell us about, how you prepare for that or what that would look like. I know 4 years is a long time away, but, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, although it's a political appointment, judges are not political. What simply happens is we do our job, and then the public decides whether we're going to be retained by vote on the general election ballot, or whether we're going to be removed from the bench. That information comes from a lot of forms. Individuals that appear before the court will complete surveys. That would also include the attorneys that appear before you will complete surveys, and that information is available to the public to see what the perception is about how a judge is performing. And if a judge is not performing, obviously individuals read that and they can decide whether to vote to retain or vote to excuse a judge. So that'll happen in 4 years.
Judge Jackson, we appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Erica Worth is an Indigenous author whose work has appeared in BuzzFeed, LitHub, and the Kenyon Review. She has a new literary horror novel called White Horse, which was released on Monday. Erica joins us now virtually to tell us more about this new book. Hi, Erica. Welcome back.
Hi there. Thank you.
So give our viewers a quick synopsis of your new book.
Sure. And I just want to say I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so honored to be here with such impressive women. This is, again, an honor. The short log line is essentially that it's a Indigenous literary horror novel, but the slightly longer one it's about urban Indian Carrie, who loves heavy metal and horror, but despises a mother she thinks abandoned her when she was 2 days old. And then her super sweet, well-intentioned white cousin Debbie finds this ancient bracelet of her mother's, and the minute the main character Carrie touches it, the ghost of her mother begins haunting her. And on top of it, this sort of, I guess you could call him evil Bigfoot character, invades her dreams. And she decides she has to find out what happened to her mother after all.
How would you say this book is different from your other releases?
Well, I did used to write poetry in a former life. I think that's died. I wrote a couple of books, Crazy Horse's Girlfriend, Buckskin Cocaine, You Who Enter Here, and they were realism, right? They didn't have any supernatural aspects, but I'm kind of a nerd. I wanted to get back to my nerd roots, and I started reading, Mexican Gothic, and my friend Stephen Graham Jones, right? My Indigenous brother from another mother, had a similar trajectory where he wrote realism and then came back to his nerd roots in horror. And I could see the way in which I loved the darker edge of things. I love these kind of more nerdy, interesting, compelling, magical things. There was a way for me to marry those things, the more gritty realism subject matter being an urban Indian, and the more like fun, nerdy, darker things in this particular book, which is horror. So.
That's a great segue into my next question, which is really about your thought process. As you just mentioned, to think about this storyline, where do you get inspiration from, and how does that come together for you?
That's a great question. I think a lot of writers, I think it's a bit of a mystery, right? What makes us want to do this thing? And I published with very small presses. This is my first with a big five, right? A big New York press, Macmillan, Flatiron. So this is some way in which it's different in that regard, to go back to your earlier question. But as far as inspiration goes, it was, like I said, going back to my nerd roots. But the other part of it was my grandmother. I'd always been told that she had suicided. And then when my mother had a cop neighbor look at the paperwork, her death certificate, etc., the cop was saying, you know what, this looks doctored and there's something wrong here. And I hate to tell you this, but it looks like it's possible your father murdered your mother. And so this tension over what really happened with my grandmother, did she suicide, was she murdered, has kind of been this underlying current in my family ever since.
I can imagine. That seems like quite the story. I want to talk about how you write about horror, because I think in so many Native cultures, like horror is something that seems something that you don't really talk about. But I'm curious, how that plays out for you.
Yeah, that's what's funny about it. My friend Kayla Shaggy, she's a horror comic book artist. And what's funny is that, I'm a very urban Indian. I'm of descent. That's all. Some of my family is from northern Mexico. The other part, they're of some Black descent, and they're from the Southeast. And, my family was in urban areas in Texas and now in Denver. And yet, every time I meet people from like Dineta, or I meet like people from Canada who are Cree, they're fascinated by horror. But I think it's this idea of this public perception, right? Should we talk about it? This, maybe it's taboo because maybe, folks will think, non-natives will think badly of us. And my feeling is, maybe we should think about what other natives would think about it. Maybe we should be taking from our own materials, from our own stuff. And it's also a way to kind of process the darker things like boarding school or day school, which my grandmother went to in Houston, in a way that's kind of indigenous and cathartic. And I also think, in some ways, some of the things that we don't want to talk about, it does come back to that shame that people learned either in boarding schools or in day schools. And I think we should unlearn that shame and imagine that we're writing for each other, and that, if we write good stories, perhaps other folks are invited, but they're not the primary audience.
Well, Erica, thank you so much, and we're excited to read your novel.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.